Welcome back to BaldHeaded Metal, guys, and welcome back to another podcast of Bonded by Metal with Andrew McKay Smith from Scars and Guitars and yours truly. Today we had an interesting topic to talk about. We'll talk about kind of metal rivalries, metal feuds, or metal, the time it just doesn't click or they have fights against each other, whatever it may be. And we'll take it on the road here with different topics. And I'll have Andrew kind of kick it off with one of the particular topics you think is going to be good to start here.
Thanks, mate. Good to be joining you for yet another show. Why don't we hit the big one as a metal fan? Especially when I was growing up, there was no topic bigger in the schoolyard, so to speak, than who's better, Metallica or Megadeth. Okay. Now, I want to suspend disbelief for a moment because there are many subjects there are a few subjects less absurd than these comparison topics because, we're all, you and I, we're adults, we've got mortgage or rent and I've got kids and got to put petrol in the car and got to put food on the table and all of that sort of stuff. So we get all of that. These topics are really just here for our entertainment. So that said, moving forward, let's address the subject at hand. Who is better, Metallica or Megadeth? It's obviously Megadeth, right? So, I didn't always take that view. I think the issue is who should receive credit for creating thrash metal. And it should always be that thrash metal's chief architect.
Dave Mustaine.
It's Dave Mustaine, really. James Hetfield learned a lot from Dave Mustaine. He's on record as saying that, as James Hetfield and Dave Mustaine learned a lot from listening to Michael Schenker. Okay. I think early Metallica definitely trumps early Megadeth, but I think as the band evolved and certainly as the careers became more obvious that they weren't going to go away, that they were heavy metal forces to be reckoned with, Megadeth came into their own, particularly with the lineup, Ellefson, Menzer, Friedman, Mustaine. I think Metallica, the word has not benefited. I'm not going to say that, but when Cliff Burton was tragically killed in the bus crash in Sweden, they had a massive bump after that. Fans understandably mourned as the band mourned the loss of Burton, and it also happened just after the release of one of the greatest albums ever recorded, Master of Puppets.
Yeah.
But overall, I must say that I think it's hard to say which band has had a more consistent career because they've both had absolutely atrocious albums in their catalogue.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult for me to pick a worse album between St. Anger and Risk. Both of them are atrocious albums.
Yeah.
But on the whole, I think personally, Megadeth are just a far more enjoyable band to listen to. I think their contribution to heavy metal is greater. I know that's a very controversial thing to say, especially when we're talking about Metallica, but I think that no Dave Mustaine, no Metallica, no thrash metal. The Metallica doesn't evolve the way the band did. So there you go.
And I'll even take it into a different stratosphere here. I personally think Metallica was a better band overall because I like more albums from Metallica, personally on a personal level. But the feud between these two bands was just something that wasn't squashed until the early 2000s. The just back and forth of Dave Mustaine and Lars and James Hetfield always arguing with one another. And Dave Mustaine always had this sour taste in his mouth after he was kicked out of Metallica, right? For being this kind of alcoholic, dangerous element in the band. And I think that fueled Megadeth and created with anger some of the best records in thrash. Peace Sells, Rust in Peace. We got Killing Is My Business, great albums. But Metallica, from a perspective of how good or bad one band is, Metallica's influence with those first four albums, even Black Album, what it did for metal in terms of introducing a lot more to people, I don't think you can even compare. Megadeth has never gotten to that stratosphere. And I think their feud between each other is the thing I want to even talk to you about, is how stupid it was. Yes, Dave Mustaine wrote Four Horsemen on the first album, and they used his song and didn't give him credit to it. Yes, you were always in the shadow of Metallica, but you did something that nobody else done. Rust in Peace will always be solidified as not just one of the best heavy metal records, one of the best thrash records, one of the best rock records ever produced with the most killer lineup. And I thought the feud between them was so immature, and I can't believe it took him that long to be able to squash it and move past it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was powered by James Hetfield nonchalance toward Dave Mustaine. I don't think Lars has ever been truly nonchalant toward Dave. Actually, I think Lars has given Dave his due credit in the media.
Yeah.
And Dave's patently absurd desire to, like his film when he was in Santanga, he was talking about how what did he say? It's out there for people to watch, but it was a grown man complaining about being kicked out of the band some 20 years earlier, and it was like as if he hadn't had the career that he enjoyed to that date.
Yeah.
He was talking to Lars about how he constantly hears about Kirk or whatever it might be, and Lars quite rightly says, "I find it very hard to comprehend that you have this view about me and about our band, and about, and even I think he says something about the career you've enjoyed today." And it is, it's ridiculous. But Dave obviously has a bee in a bonnet, in his bonnet. Hopefully, it is well. He seems to have turned it into a positive insofar as made it the fire under his ass to write so many killer riffs.
Yeah.
There's the legend that a few of the songs on Master of Puppets are actually there are Dave Mustaine songs as well, and you can hear Leper Messiah. I've got to say, that riff in Leper Messiah is without question a Dave Mustaine-esque riff. So if he did write it, it makes a lot of sense. The credits are on the albums for all to see on Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning. And I think that's why Dave Mustaine is so important. He's definitely got a chip on his shoulder. Having met the man, I've experienced some of his Dave Mustaineisms is probably the best, easiest way to say it. But I think parking the man's very obvious hot temper and disagreeable temperament at times in favor of his very obvious talent, I just think he's so important to heavy metal. I think he's just one of the guys that if he doesn't exist, heavy metal doesn't evolve the way it does. There's a few people that I was, you're talking Michael Schenker, Dave Mustaine, Richie Blackmore, Jimi Hendrix. He's up there. He's actually that important. James Hetfield is too, no question. James Hetfield is as well. It comes down to popularity contests, though. A lot of these sorts of things, though, don't they? And if the Metallica are about 10 times more popular than Megadeth,
And I think that's what he always had.
attention.
That's what he had always a problem with. He's like, why am I not getting as big as Metallica? Why? He always had that particular chip on his shoulder all the time. And I think at some point in time in the beginning, it's fair as he was cleaning himself up. But at some point, you have to move on. You have to be an adult. It took him such a long time. I'm glad they've patched things up now, and they're good with each other, and they've moved past their younger selves, so to say. But I was going to move into a second one here, and this one I thought you were going to start with this particular one because I don't think there's a bigger feud, fight, rivalry, whatever you want to call it, to me in metal. Maybe I'm a little younger than you. It was metal versus hair metal. And oh my God, it's like the rest of the community had the eyes on hair metal is that this is not real music. This is crap. It's lost its edge. It doesn't have its kind of underground roots, right? It's like hair metal is just commercial crap. How did you feel about it? Especially, I think you were in that era when it was happening.
I was at the tail end of it, no doubt. The first heavy metal album I ever bought when it was in market. So when it came out, 1988, Poison's Open Up and Say Ah. And I still think to this day it's a good, solid album. It's not a great album, but it's a good, solid commercial album, and it acts as a gateway for me to get into Iron Maiden, Faith No More, Megadeth at all. It was an important album in that way, in the same way that maybe Korn might have done, or new metal might have done for people of a later generation, or Limp Bizkit or what have you. But yeah, I find this one here the most ridiculous. Maybe not the most ridiculous, but it's up there.
It's up there
from the perspective that the glam bands, the so-called hair metal bands, these are all credible musicians. Dokken, Winger, White Lion, Poison,
Van Halen.
Oh gosh, I mean Van Halen. I mean Van Halen's the greatest guitarist of all time and one of the greatest musicians ever.
Yeah.
And people have just got to park what I think the media was really driven by the media, and it was in particular I noticed it was driven when I was a young fella by the media's perception around hair metal when grunge came in, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, etc., Stone Temple Pilots, and just the way that credible musicians in bands like Warrant were thrown under the bus in the media and became punchlines. You know, these people should never have become punchlines. Okay, some of the antics were a bit silly. You know, Motley Crue's behaviour was a bit silly, but the music is what counts, and it just comes down to personal preference. So I think looking back now, some of the try-hard grunge bands look far worse than the glam bands. I mean, the glam bands, it was more theatre. So yeah, that's an argument that I've never really, I understand why it exists, but I've never bought into it because I still love Pride by White Lion. It was such an important album in my evolution as a fan. Vito Brada's guitar playing all time, he's right up there with Van Halen.
I'll tell you
So
one thing though, but I was one of those people. I was definitely one of those people that was, and there was a community of elitist metal fans who didn't consider it to be real music because the lyrics were a lot of times about having fun and partying. They weren't politically driven. They didn't have something to say. And at least that's how I felt when I was a young person, right? But at the same time, I would listen to Def Leppard and I couldn't deny how good the band was. You know, and at the same time, I loved Kiss, glam rock, where kind of it all started from. I couldn't deny how good the music was. And I couldn't grasp this idea that it's okay if it's not always serious. Look at power metal. Power metal is fantasy. It has nothing to do with reality. It's escapism. It doesn't always have to be harsh reality. And if we're talking about harsh lyrics and being real, the fuck, look at black metal and all their satanic imagery and the things they began in the beginning. It's literally laughable. I'd much rather listen to something from hair metal where they're talking about partying and having fun than some dude in the basement with corpse paint telling me that I should be worshiping Satan, you know? I'm sure we're going to get into that black metal jig as well. But I agree with you. As I've grown up, you put yourself in a box by saying I can only like this kind of metal and I can't like this kind of metal. There's good music in commercial music, in commercial metal. There's good music in that underground stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There were so many great albums that were released in the mid 90s. I think the album was Ultravox by Warrant, 1995, which was just a hard hitting affair. But because it was Warrant, nobody gave a shit. And that was true for Skid Row too. I couldn't believe when people turned on Skid Row. That was just crazy. I didn't even consider them a glam band, but whatever. But other people did. They were more like Guns N' Roses or something. But
They consider Guns N' Roses a hair metal band. I don't just why because Axl Rose had a headband or something.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah,
It's ridiculous. These are rock bands. They're rock bands. They just don't have the aesthetic that the grunge bands did. And I think most of the hair metal thing was motivated by the media's obsession with grunge and them needing to sort of put down another genre and a set of musicians in favor of grunge. I don't know whether it was some of the fans, if I recall correctly, it wasn't really driven by the fans back then. I'm just trying to think. Your record collection would have the Cult, Nirvana, Poison, particularly when Native Tongue came out, 92, I think that was. That was, you'd listen to three back to back, you wouldn't even think about it. It was just, that's rock music, or that's just hard rock music, I suppose.
That was me in Russia. When I came to the United States, you definitely felt a divide among fans. And actually, one divide I never understood was punk and metal. You know, like there's a big disconnect between punk and metal where they didn't even consider punk to be music. It's just like noise and garbage. It's like, dude, thrash metal, it's punk influenced. You know, George Harris famously, remember they were asking them, oh, do you like any punk music? He's like, what? We're not punk. Don't say we're punk. He was pissed. He was pissed to even be compared to a punk. But what, the Ramones, the Clash, the Sex Pistols, they don't have quality music. They don't have great records. It's like, it was a little bit of a ridiculous kind of, again, elitist mindset, even from musicians themselves looking down on punk or looking down on hair metal.
Yeah, the punk v heavy metal one, I think, it has its roots in like this working class punk aesthetic. people who work in the manufacturing industry, like way back in the late 60s, early 70s, and wanting to do something with their spare time and having all of this frustration about being working class and the like. And then heavy metal coming along, and then heavy metal not necessarily being inspired by, but then you had the glam thing, but the original glam thing, I'm talking about New York Dolls and Slade and all of that sort of stuff, where it was about,
T-Rex.
they look ridiculous, those bands. I've got to say,
Yeah.
looking back now, they look terrible.
Yeah.
They look like they've raided their mum's wardrobe.
But don't you
And
talk about Slade, man. Don't you talk about Slade.
on a Slade are fantastic. I love Noddy Holder, mate. Great singer,
Yeah.
So, but I think when we compare the two, it's impossible to do it without looking at the various eras and about how punk inspired heavy metal. I don't think heavy metal's really ever inspired punk, but punk is all the way through heavy metal. It's a precursor
I
to
agree.
heavy metal.
I agree.
So I at one level I don't understand the fans though. I went out with a girl back in the day, like 25 years ago, and her brother was one of those hardcore punk,
Mohawk
guys, which was ridiculous even back in those days that sort of thing existed. But anyway, it did. And yeah, I was a huge Black and Death metal fan, and I didn't even think much of it. But here I go to their parties down to here. Yeah, I copped it a little bit. I had to be careful. I had a guy try to fight me, and he had I remember telling one of the guys in Hatebreed, Wayne, the guitarist, this guy had a Hatebreed t-shirt on, and he'd been staring at me for a bit, and I wasn't sure whether he was high or drunk or both, or just being a dickhead. Turns out he was being all three. And I had the long hair. I didn't even have a band t-shirt on. I think I just had a black t-shirt on because or a jumper on. It was freezing where we were, and yeah. And I remember this guy. I think he saw me bopping along to Danzig a bit too hard.
You know what? I was. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go, mate. Yeah.
No, because you gave me this. Made me remind me of a story where moshing came from. It came from punk.
Yeah.
It's actually I read in like a reading like the history of heavy metal and punk, and they were talking about it. It was this idea that punk bands were like just moshing all in, and metalheads weren't. And if you ever had a punk guy come over to a metal show, fights. Metal guy in a punk band concert, fights. But for one time, they kind of went in and they saw that they both like moshing, they like going crazy. Like, fuck it, okay, I guess we should kind of squash it because we're both influenced by it. We're both doing the same thing. We're both fighting the system, So it was very much a lot of things were in tune with it, and I thought like you said, one can't be without the other.
No, indeed. It's I remember the antagonisms toward. It was never really metal fans toward punk fans. It was more just the punk fans sort of continuing on with it through the 90s onwards.
Yeah,
I wasn't around before then, but going to shows, I definitely remember the antagonism, especially when the hardcore, that New York hardcore inspired scene, like I talk about with Hatebreed, when that started coming around. But the New York hardcore scene was metallic hardcore. They were as influenced by Metallica as what they were by GBH, for God's sakes, these guys. So a lot of it just came down to aesthetics, I think. I don't think it was ever driven by, I don't even know whether the musicians and the bands gave a shit and the punk bands gave a shit. It was just something that the fans sort of got into and carried on with. So there you go.
How did you feel about this whole? I'm like dipping into a lot of different topics and like moving from one kind of movement to the other. But the idea, how did you feel about the whole new metal / kind of rap influence that happened, in which in many ways inspired hardcore, inspired a lot of these kinds of band, Five Finger Death Punch, Hatebreed it doesn't have hip hop influence, but it has the added hip hop almost attitude, the way they would dress sometimes. That idea of rap music or its influence into heavy metal.
Yeah, on the fence about this one, I think, as you know, because I think because rap, because I used to read so much of the music media back in the day, the magazines, that is, there was always this idea that you were seen to be open-minded if you were a heavy metal fan and you listened to rap music and urban music. I know we've talked about this before, but occasionally I'd pick up Source or whatever it might have been, the urban music magazines. There was never any comments in there about rap and urban music fans and needing to be open-minded and listen to heavy metal or other styles of music. It was always, that's their thing and that's what they're doing. Talking about the bands where it manifests the hardest, Limp Bizkit in particular, and all of those bands that sounded like that. Machine Head's The Burning Red. I didn't mind The Burning Red that much. I didn't think it was certainly it's far from the worst album in Machine Head's catalogue. But when you're talking about Limp Bizkit, I absolutely hated it when it came out. And Fred Durst's antics, I still can't stand.
I think that he's just a bad example because look at Anthrax and Public Enemy. Look at Beastie Boys and Kerry King, which to me is funny because Kerry King did a song with Beastie Boys, but then with Rob Flynn make that the Burning Red album, he publicly shitted on Rob Flynn and saying you've betrayed by having this rap influence in your music, which is kind of hypocritical from a Kerry King standpoint. I've always thought I didn't like it in the beginning either, despite the fact that I like both genres. But as the time went on and people have gotten more creative with it and learned how to meld it together. For example, rap lyrics are longer. They're not chorus focused. They can really tell a whole story that sometimes a traditional rock or metal song can't. It has certain elements that you can kind of interject. I've just checked out, for example, Infected Rain. I don't know if you ever heard of this band. And they put in electronic music mixed in with melodic death metal, mixed in with kind of a new metal sound. And it sounds amazing because now bands have said, okay, how can I take it's, I think, a lot more thoughtful than something like Limp Bizkit, which was riding on the wave.
I think like the example of Fred Durst is an interesting one because of the way he walked in those music videos was ridiculous. He was a character. He still is a bit of a caricature. Now he looks like a bloke who owns what do you call them? Trailer parks in the US. We call them caravan parks. He looks like he owns a trailer park or something. A redneck sort of a thing, don't you think? A Hunter S. Thompson cross redneck. He's always been a caricature, that bloke. And I agree he's a bad example, but he's the most prominent example. There were other, that whole scene wasn't bad. The whole thing, it's just the leading lights, I don't think, acquitted themselves very well. Korn's antics in the media. I'll never forget laughing so hard at Trace Bruins from Mr. Bungle and Faith No More. He recorded King for a Day, Fool for a Lifetime, Faith No More album. One of the most underrated guitarists ever. Okay. And the guys in Korn had credited him with being a massive inspiration. He was talking into the European press. He was incredulous, I think, that they listed him as an influence because he absolutely hates the genre and the band, and was talking about how when the band is touring Europe, that the fans need to pick up rocks and throw them at the band. And he used these examples, and he was quite right to point out, like, Belgium, which I think is where beer basically comes from, certainly the beer that we all know and love, and beer's goes right back to Mesopotamia and Sumeria, I get that. But beer, as we understand it, the way the brewing techniques and I think they come from Belgium, if I'm not mistaken. And Korn, and I'm going on my memory here, and I'm going and assuming Trey knows his facts, and I'm sure he's the type of guy that does. But he was saying that they shipped in crates, like pallet loads of Coors beer. Now, I've drunk enough beer in my lifetime to know that Coors doesn't compare to some of the greatest European ales and pilsners out there. It just doesn't.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
They brought that into the country where beer was practically invented. Okay. So all of the beer selections that they had, they chose to bring in this football drinking beer shit. And he was saying how this demonstrates the worst of American culture as it is perceived overseas. And to be honest, he's quite right to point that out. Korn have since gotten over themselves. I think those guys are now stand-up guys from what I've read in the media and the like. But back then, they were just precocious and atrocious.
See, for me, it was a very natural blend to have rap and metal because I've mentioned it before, of the same thematics. The thematics of social injustice, the thematics of political and lyrics. Look at Rage Against the Machine, heavily influenced by rap. And that's for example, if we had a bad example with Limp Bizkit, Rage Against the Machine is a fantastic example where it completely works and introducing that funk element that they had in there. New bands like Rise of the North Star, or even bands that weren't considered hip hop, but were put into that group like Suicidal Tendencies, where in the 90s they were banned from LA because too many gang members would come to their neighborhoods, and they were grouped into this kind of Latin / gang culture, and they protested against it. I think those two blend well together. It's just only now are we seeing good examples of it. And when it first initially began, they try to use the popularity of rap to kind of put themselves a little higher. Because when you mentioned about antics, it goes into another like in side by side comparison, right? Is like, well, how about black metal with all their shit and stupid antics and Varg and Euronymous and all the things, church burnings that they were doing.
Yeah, the black metal thing. I'll never forget reading reports like this is way back before the internet kicked in. Norway and Sweden were so far away; they felt like they were on some Arctic peninsula in a distant galaxy.
Yeah.
Weren't they? So you'd read, and the weird names, Euronymous and Varg Vikernes and all this sort of shit, and you were like, "What the heck? What is this stuff?"
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the death metal versus black metal thing. If we could segue into that, that I think has its roots in the emergence of the internet. Okay, so death metal fans being around since the early 80s or thereabouts with Cam Lee and Possessed and those sort of bands evolving. And then black metal, I know it was around back then, and Venom and Bathory, or had its emergence back then, but it didn't really kick in until Gen 2 with Mayhem and Satyricon and all of those sorts of bands.
Gorgoroth and Mayhem. Yeah.
Exactly, Gorgoroth, yeah. And those bands, I distinctly remember trawling the internet back in like 95, 96, definitely by 96. And they had pages, they had web pages, and they had a presence, and they had fans in chat rooms talking about them. Not so much the death metal bands, not so much. You couldn't really go on there and talk to anybody about, you could, but it was rare to talk about Cannibal Corpse versus Emperor. Everybody wanted to talk about Emperor. It was motivated by this online community. And that's where I think a lot of the pretense came from, was a lot of this grandstanding that we know people carry on with still to this day on the internet. And it was very embryonic back then, but that's where I believe the clash between the two came from. Because even death metal, look at the guys in Cannibal Corpse. They've always just worn denim jeans, like denim color, the blue, with black t-shirts. Whereas the black metal thing, yeah, it's simple. It was more like you're wearing white, shitty high tops or black boots, denim jeans, camo jacket, and your death metal band t-shirt. Whereas black metal it looked pretentious again, didn't it? I mean, those guys with their capes and stuff, never got into the goth element personally, but it was a big part of it. And Glenn Benton from Deicide talks about, there's a Blabbermouth article there where he talks about meeting Euronymous for the first time, and he was introduced to him, I think, by the drummer from Emperor. And he thought, I don't remember the show, but he said that Euronymous looked like a bloke called Squiggy from the show Laverne and Shirley, which was, did Squiggy, I don't know whether people watching know Squiggy and Laverne and Shirley, but I had to go and look up this guy, and yeah, he does a little, because he looks like a bit of a dork, let's face it. Those early photos of Euronymous downstairs in that shop that he owned with the midriff Venom top and Sadistic Execution top that he's wearing, and he's a really skinny little white guy and stuff, it's ridiculous. But he's looking all tough and stuff, and I think if he met some of the Mexican Slayer fans, I think that he wouldn't be laughing. So, I don't think he'd be so tough, to be honest with you, after that. But I think that's where the genesis of it all comes from anyway, that clash between the two.
I also got to say that I enjoyed about death metal, even if their lyrics are serious or goofy, like Cannibal Corpse. A lot of people don't understand that they're being facetious. They're not serious. Their job is to, like, we want to shock people as much as we can until it just completely like, oh my God, what the fuck am I listening to? Versus black metal, where they took themselves so seriously. And that's the reason, actually, I didn't get into black metal for a very long time, because the whole satanic thing around it, that they were serious about it, And there was a lot of neo-Nazi kind of support for it in the beginning. So much so, that's why I appreciated Abbott, the first black metal band I ever got into. He was like, look, we want to separate ourselves from that. We like the beginnings of black metal and what it can offer for heavy metal, but we don't want to be connected to all this satanic neo-Nazi crap. And I was turned off by that genre as well. It was just, like you said, corny. It looks like they watched Lord of the Rings a little too much. But at the same time, as the time went by, it really grown into its own. And I think the feud, especially between death metal and black metal, completely faded away, because there's so much parallel between the two now.
They're the same fan base. It's ludicrous. If anybody is an emerging fan and they've decided to say, well, I can't listen to death metal because I like black metal, or vice versa, crazy. I don't think anybody would these days, because of the massive blend between the two of them. you're far more likely to hear a band that has a blend of the two genres than you are likely to hear a band that is just standalone one or the other. I don't even think I know there are some old school black metal bands coming out all the time. I get that.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly from death metal's sake, I mean, all of the big four of Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, Morbid Angel, and Deicide, they've all had black metal influences creep in, just slight ones creep in. You listen to Satyricon, they've sort of become a rock band there for a bit. With what was the album? Was it Volcano or the one after Volcano, early 2000s? But great music, all killer music. Even Mayhem have sort of gone into this quasi Motorhead thing. So they all evolve and they all borrow from each other. Most of these feuds, the theme I'm picking up, they're historical. I think there's been this massive flattening of things these days where even you and I have had coming from different, not even different eras, but just different parts of an era where I'm not a rap or an urban music fan and you enjoy it. If I'd grown up 5 years, if I was born 5 years later, I'd probably be like you, in terms of have a collection of rap and urban music. Whereas instead of rap and urban music, I've got a collection of so-called glam albums from back in the day. That's the difference. And I think it's just inspired by from where your perspective is rooted. These days, I think the division is far more along social, like your outlook, political.
I would say also with it has a lot to do with young people and their angst. Because as bands grow, as the fans grow, hopefully you mature as a person and you tend to let go of these stupid grievances or things that you would hold on to. Even to this day, like for example, I don't want to start a fire, which I'm going to with this saying this. There's a particular feud nowadays between bands. There's a band called Liliac and there's a band called The Warning. And one time Liliac said something during interviews like, would you play a concert with The Warning? And their response is like, oh yeah, we'll let them open for us. Which is a disrespectful comment, but the oldest person in the band is like what, 23, 24 years old.
Yeah.
It was like, they don't know anything yet. And I don't mean that as a disrespect to them. And people are literally, this like war between, oh, don't mention this band when you do a reaction for this one. Don't mention, I understand where they're coming from because they're loyal fans, but you have to step back and realize how ridiculous it all is. Because first of all, they're teens. They're going to be, they're probably, if not, they're already sorry, they've already grown past it. And you have to learn how to patch things up and not create it like sort of what happened with Megadeth and Metallica, what happened in hip hop with Biggie Smalls and Tupac, where there was people getting killed because of it. It's like, it's just ridiculous. There's no need for that. It's music. You don't like each other, just move on. But there's no need for fans to fight each other. And I think it has a lot to do with age, I think, with our angst and sometimes our boredom when we have nothing else to do.
Yeah, I think you just nailed it right there. You're absolutely on point there. How much have you got going on in your life? You and I are married. We've got plenty of other things. I've got so much that I can be doing. My life has evolved to the point, in a positive way, I might suggest, where whenever I'm doing something, it means I'm not doing something else. Does that make sense? It means like every day is full of things to do.
Yes.
Okay, this is my outlet, music. It's one of the only outlets I've got, along with going swimming occasionally. I'm raising 2 daughters with my wife. There's so much going on. I don't have energy or time to think about which bands I don't like from my youth or what have you, or to think about ongoing feuds. People have to grow up in many respects and to embrace things that they may not have in their youth. Anybody carrying on with a Metallica versus Megadeth debate these days, but really meaning it, we're talking about it, okay? We're just chatting.
Yeah,
but anybody who really means it, I'd probably suggest, to your point, is either bored or, needs to go and get a girlfriend or something. It's very weird overall.
And I was going to kind of lean into this topic, which it's an obvious one, but I think it lends itself also to how we view everything. And that's the old school discussion of metal and rap versus typical and just the government, and how they came up with the whole advisory sticker thing. And the idea that this, not even rivalry, but this hate towards metal music, that it's somehow corrupting our children, that rap. And believe me, I think there's examples in both of those musics that do that. But to my point that there's things like that in pop music. There's bad apples everywhere, right? But I very much believe this idea that music in no way, shape, or form is going to force you to kill your girlfriends like it happened with Slayer because you listen to Slayer lyrics. You know, it has a lot to do with a person who's not healthy from the beginning, and it just amplified who he was already.
Yeah, look at terrorism. There, to focus on my point around terrorism, it's an ideologically, in most instances, it's ideologically motivated. Okay, since the instances that the media has grabbed a hold of, and Tipper Gore and those people back in the day, that they grabbed a hold of to use as examples of the nefarious nature of heavy metal were bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Claiming that Rob Halford was singing something backwards, inspiring people to shoot themselves. Same with Bob Daisley's lyrics with Ozzy Osbourne was saying in Suicide Solution, which apparently Ozzy is sorry, not Ozzy, Bob has said was written about his friend Bon Scott because of how much he was drinking.
Yeah.
Okay, none of this stuff is designed to inspire. Wasp, Blackie Lawless went through it as well. All of these bands.
Twisted Sister.
Twisted Sister, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Dee Snider so articulately took down Tipper Gore. It almost stopped the Parents Music Resource, PMRC, in its tracks back then. The person we have the most to thank for as rock and music fans for putting a halt to all of that bullshit is actually Frank Zappa.
I didn't know
that. He's the one who stood up and took the bullets. Yeah, because Blackie Lawless, and they were too young back then. They were only in their late 20s or early 20s to sort of understand the implications of this stuff. Frank got it. He understood that it would lead to mass censorship, which look at the sort of censorship issues we're dealing with these days, cancel culture and the like. He knew where this stuff could end up, and unfortunately, here we are. A lot of bands and a lot of people, not really bands, but a lot of comedians. Dave Chappelle. How ludicrous is it? They're trying to cancel him. The far left, well, not even the far left these days. It's just the media, and many on the left are trying to cancel him. And this idea that you can silence speech and call it hate speech, and with music, you can attribute, if we let them listen to Cannibal Corpse, which is basically just horror music in horror movies in music. If we let them listen to this, there's going to be mass suicides and mass shootings and all this sort of stuff. It is bullshit. There is no credible link between violent behavior and listening to this music. And honestly, that has been studied at an academic level. There are white papers about it. The biggest issues that drive social upheaval in that respect are not having a father in the household and the breakdown of the family unit.
And I think it's also very difficult sometimes I'm not a parent, so I can't speak on that, but I can only see an observation it's sometimes out of our own not knowing what to do or where to pounce, we blame others, and we don't know how to handle the situation. And that there's a big responsibility as a parent to guide our children, and that there's bad influences on every single corner. The music is, for example, you listen to Slayer. I love what Slayer said one time. They were criticizing them for Angel of Death. He's like, well, you're not reading the lyrics correctly. It's a story of how horrible this Dr. Death was. And on top of that, he goes like, there's some bands and some artists that sing about the beauty of life, love, and wonderful things. Tom Araya said that. He goes, and we sing about the dark side of life. And that's equally as important. And that's where I've always liked about heavy metal. It tackles serious topics. It doesn't always make you smile and laugh. It's going to make you think about what you just saw. Refuse and Resist from Sepultura. It's a very potent song of all ages, right? Resisting of just being put into this box and put into this corner of this is what you're going to be. And Suicidal Tendencies. Oh my God, how many songs do they have on those kinds of topics? And I think it's where a lot of very poignant lyrics were made. And it's not their fault if people take and misinterpret their songs. I mean, look at Sting with the Police when he made that song. Oh my God, I'll be watching you. I'll always watch.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks it's a love song. It's about a stalker.
Yeah. There's a few examples like that, and Jordan Peterson said it during his interview with Kathy Newman, where in order to make people think, you have to risk offending them.
Yes.
And that's such a true statement there. And that's the basis of why cancel culture and censorship it's evil. Really, it truly is, because we have to explore these ideas. The fact that people think, especially these recent college graduates and university graduates, think that they've figured everything out, and we don't. You don't have to say that, because we already know it's bad. It's bullshit. They don't. They haven't been alive long enough. You know, it's people just need to realize, I think, that the world is a vast place. Travel more, go and see different cultures, speak to different people, learn about people from different backgrounds, understand exactly what their challenges are in their life. You're far less likely to engage in cancel culture and censorship, and even worry about these absurd things about whether or not and I've seen the debates online about cancelling Angel of Death and these sorts of things do point people in the right direction, insofar as this is a heinous crime that occurred. Okay,
Yes.
dive into Wikipedia and then understand Joseph Mengele, I think his name was, and understand how atrocious it was. These are historical figures. Okay, this happened. Okay, let it never happen again. If that's the jumping point, meaning you listen to that Slayer song, Angel of Death, and you go, I want to investigate these lyrics and the horrors that they are associated with. Well, now you've been informed. Now, when you hear somebody talking about these things in a fairly nonchalant manner, you go, hang on a sec, I know history.
Yeah.
You don't have to say that Slayer was the starting point, your jumping off point, but you now know history and you know how atrocious what occurred was, and you can inform people and just in a conversational manner. There's the same thing with communist China and the like, and the evils of socialism in that respect. You know, I know it's not spoken about so much, but in lyrics and in words, but I just wish people would they'd be more willing, musicians especially, and lyricists, be more willing to inject their lyrics with these things, because it is a way for us to become informed, a legitimate way for us to become informed.
I'll give you a real life example where it completely worked for me, and I didn't come into it with the intention to do this. And when I started working as a personal trainer, I had a coworker that happened to be gay. And up to that point, really, I grew up in a traditional Russian Jewish home. I really didn't have much interaction with it. Most of my friends weren't, everything like that. And I thought it was a good idea. I came up to him and I just said, like, hey, I don't really have much experience and we've become kind of friendly here. Is it okay if I ask you some questions? I don't want to offend, but I want to know. And you had to see his face. His face was like, I really? It's like nobody's ever come up to me and asked me. I'm like, well, how am I going to learn if I don't ask?
Yeah.
And I would completely express myself. And I'm sure maybe some of the things I said weren't exactly right, or maybe some of the opinions I had weren't exactly right. But he was there and he understood that wavelength and he was able to stop. He's like, no, I don't like this because of this, or this is how I feel. Well, you can feel this way. And by the end of the conversation, we only became closer friends. And that was such a learning experience for me. And I'm sure even for him as well, to speak to your point that it's important to talk about topics that are uncomfortable, that might be a different opinion from you, that not what you feel. There's constantly, I don't feel what people say, left, right, and middle all the time. I might disagree with my brother, but by the end of the day, we finish that beer, we shake each other's hand, and we try to meet in the middle. Is that person who literally is harming people, I think, personally. He's physically harming. That's a person I can't, like we were talking about Manowar, Carl, I can't look at him the same anymore after that story, because that's physically harming people. You're doing things that are or at the very least, you're part of the system that's going to be harming kids. That's a whole different story. But if we're just having a conversation, that's how things really get solved, and that's where I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, the Man of War thing. Even Judas Priest, I think Holland, I can't remember his first name, was it Dave Holland, the drummer, was convicted of molesting a bloke in a wheelchair, a student that he had in a wheelchair. The bands, and we've spoken a lot about Man of War. Man of War have, to the best of my knowledge, and believe me, I've searched, so they haven't released a statement about Carl Logan. We've got to make money. Let's continue forward. It's like, no, actually, Joey, you should address this. This is a topic that is up there with one of the most important that I think you need to address, and it happened in your band. Okay. Judas Priest glossed over the thing with Holland as well. Even though he was out of the band by then, it's like, does this behavior just start afterwards? Or were there signs that it started beforehand?
And you close your eyes on it.
Yeah, no issue with bands who try to own these sorts of things. Where the issue does come about is when I remember, I'll never forget having an interaction with Melbourne's a very left-wing city in Australia, a bit like I suppose New York City would be or what have you. And a lot of the young people down there who edit the magazines, a lot of the magazines have their editorial team down there. And I think there was a band, I can't even remember the name of the band now. It was Near Obliviscaris. Does that band ring a bell?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Australian band, yeah.
Yeah. I'd never heard of them before, but they're much bigger overseas than they are in Australia, I've got to say. And the bassist there were accusations or thereabouts of the bassist having been involved in some domestic violence situation. So, hey, I wasn't a journalist at the time. This is a few years before I was a journalist, but I remember writing in the piece that I was commissioned to write that there were unfortunate reasons for his exit. Well, didn't she jump down my throat and say, how dare you say domestic violence is an unfortunate reason and all this sort of stuff, meaning that it was such a serious one. And I'm thinking, this is a person that doesn't have context. This is a young lady who is very politically and ideologically motivated. She's an editor of a magazine, of course. It's all got to have this extreme left-wing Marxist, almost Marxist angle. And so I simply said to her, okay, send me the police report. At the moment, it's all baseless rumor. It's all just someone said something. And she's like, well, I didn't really. And she tried to backtrack and stuff. And I said, fuck it, I'm not writing this stupid magazine anymore.
And sometimes, you know what happens? Sometimes it comes from a good place, the defense of women. It comes definitely from a good place. But sometimes it might go in the wrong direction. But sometimes it could be also justified in a moment, like if you ever heard of an American band called Argosland. Which is actually a fantastic death metal band, but they are directly tied to the KKK.
Really?
Yeah,
they're still, the KKK is still around.
yeah, they're quite still around in the United States, and they were connected with many groups, neo-Nazi and KKK groups.
Yeah.
So it's like, and you hit that, and it's like shit. It becomes a whole different thing. Sometimes it has its moments where it's justified, and it has its moments where it's like your moment where it's like, what the fuck?
Yeah. Look, the KKK thing is I mean, they're a historic. They should still be a historical artifact. I think, from what I understand, there might be a few active chapters or what have you, but by and large, you're talking about 100 people or what have you, and most of the activity occurs with these idiots online. But to have a to be in a band and have a direct association with a hate group like that, I mean, yeah, do wonders for your career. I can't really see you going to be invited on the recent Cannibal Corpse tour anytime soon.
How about we end it on a lighter note? We had like such a serious segue here. How about we end it on a lighter note? And it's metal versus grunge, Nirvana versus metal, and all these other bands that are popping up. Because I think it's a quite a big one for us both here.
Yeah, metal versus grunge. Yeah, look, I wouldn't go so far as to say I was a dyed-in-the-wall grunge fan, but it was the music that, when I was an emerging music fan, was the most prominent and popular. Never got into Nirvana, never really liked them. Same with Pearl Jam. Songs here and there, don't mind. But in terms of owning their CDs, I don't even think I've owned a CD of either, I've got to say.
Yeah.
But there were some great grunge bands, no doubt, like Sponge, Vinny Dabrowski, the singer for Sponge.
No, never heard
They're
of
a
him.
killer band. He's in a band now. Vinny's now in a band with David Ellison, that recent band that David's come out with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll tell you, I've never got into grunge myself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I do like Nirvana. You know what is? I know songs and I've listened to them. Same with Nirvana, same with Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, all these bands. Well, Helmet, a lot of people consider Helmet to be a very grungy band. I like select songs from all these bands, but I've never gotten into a full album of grunge. And not because I had some certain hate towards it as a metalhead. It just didn't appeal to me.
Yeah, it was a media manufactured, the Seattle sound and all of that sort of shit, and all of the adjacents like Smashing Pumpkins. From what I listening to those bands, as I was forced to back in the day, because they'd be in dormitories and study rooms and they'd be on in the background. They were never consistent though. Like the Smashing Pumpkins, that Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness double album thing should just have been one CD of just pure hard rock stuff, because the softer stuff that he was putting, all of the weird harpsichord shit that Billy Corgan was known for doing, is garbage. It doesn't add anything, whereas he can write a killer rock riff and a metal riff. no question. And good guitarists too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. There's not much of a division. There shouldn't be as much of a division, I think, as what there's been made out to be. They should really appeal to the same fans. Again, I think grunge more appeals to the mainstream, whereas metal is metal, But Nirvana could go away tomorrow and I'd be quite happy. Especially as a covers musician, having to play so many of their tunes. I've seen it, man. As soon as you play the opening chords to Smells Like Teen Spirit, the whole thing, the whole floor just starts bouncing. Drunk guys and girls bouncing, girls in very pretty dresses and stuff, all just going nuts. Young people do 18, 19, 20. It's like, how do you know Nirvana? Well, I know it's sort of a cultural icon these days, but do you actually know the music, or do you just know the iconography of Kurt Cobain? So, yeah, it's another weird one.
Have you ever had a problem with a non-metalhead wearing metal T-shirts like Metallica and everything like that, really not knowing anything about the band?
Oh, I think more power to them. Go ahead. My view is always like, I want metal to explode and be everywhere. So if it happens because some pretty girl wears a Motorhead T-shirt or a Metallica T-shirt, go for
it. The reason I asked that, because I think that's what happened with grunge, is that metalheads sometimes have this very closed-minded mindset of, we want to stay underground. And then grunge explodes. Well, why we're not there? Why people paying attention to them? Because that's what it means to be underground. That is what it means to be. And I think now, though, metal is starting to start hitting in the more popular stratosphere, especially in European countries with like Amorphis and Insomnium, where they're hitting top charts, Elevietti and all these other bands, where it's starting to get to a point where they top charts and it still maintains its raw edge, which I think is a very impressive thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, like what I talked about maybe the last episode or the episode before, Eric Danielson and Watain beating one of the members from ABBA, being a #1 album in Sweden. This is a satanic band, dude. Like there's no pretense there. These guys are, I'm not saying they're serious Satanists, but they're serious about what they do. And there's a lot of satanic themes and imagery and iconography associated with the group. So I think overall, it's a great thing. I've never been, like talking to Nurgle, Adam Darsky from Behemoth. Like I said, man, congratulations, you're bringing black metal's maudlin corpse into the sunlight. And he goes, well, for every person like you that appreciates that, there's many that hate me for doing it. And I understand that there are these fans that want metal to remain underground in a disgusting, gangrene flesh encrusted vault that never to be opened by the general public. It's like it's mine.
Yeah.
And I just think we'll grow up, like for all the reasons we've spoken about. Like just maybe not grow up, but just for God's sakes, get over yourselves.
At the end of the day, if you don't like a grunge song, there's a wonderful button called clicking it off, and boom, forget about it and move on to something different.
Hey, like I've said many times, say it again, don't like rap and urban music. Does that mean I have to listen to it? No, so I don't talk about it. We're talking about it because we're talking about these sorts of things, but does it come up in my day-to-day? Of course not.
And at the end of the day, you were never disrespectful towards it. You were just like, not for me.
Yeah, I mean, anybody, I've said this a lot on the podcast, my podcast, Scars and Guitars, but anybody that's up there on a stage treading the boards and actually doing it has got my respect, and that includes urban and rap artists if they're up there doing it, because its performance is not as easy as what it looks.
100%.
Hours of practice.
And for me, I have a sympathy for anybody who's trying to do, like, for example, we're both doing our own thing, right? We're all both developing ourselves in our careers or whatever it may be. And we know how hard it is. And as an adult, which a lot of young people, they don't get to that point yet. They don't know what it's like, how hard it can be to develop yourself and get something going for yourself, to see somebody else in their element and really enjoying themselves, no matter the genre, even if it's pop music and it's Cardi B or Beyonce, somebody I completely don't like, there's a beauty in somebody doing something that they love and they get paid for it. And I'll always encourage that no matter what, because it's such a wonderful feeling.
Indeed, mate. Very well said. Very eloquently put.
And I want to open it up also to people who's watching this video here about all the topics we kind of hit here. I would love to hear some of your opinions with Metallica, Megadeth, metal, new metal, kind of your opinions in general, and maybe how in the beginning you weren't so open-minded, how you changed over time. I would love to hear your stories. And I'm sure Andrew he always comes down to the comments to read some of these stories. We do check out every single comment from you guys.
Yeah, more comments, please. We'd love it. Just engage in banter. Tell us what you like about what we're talking about. Give us some suggestions for what we can talk about next. Gosh knows Joseph and I are dyed-in-the-wool metal fans, as you can all tell. So there's always going to be many different subjects we can choose, even at a moment's notice. But we want to know from your perspective, what do you want us to talk about? Okay, we're now 6 or 7 episodes deep. And I think you can tell we know what we're talking about in terms of we've got enough knowledge to be dangerous, armed and dangerous in these conversations. So let us know which topics you'd like to hear us talk about, debates, this sort of thing. What's pissing you off at the moment in the world of heavy metal? Is there anything you want us to address? We'd love to know.
Very well put, Andrew. And once again, man, that was a great chat.
Thanks, brother. Awesome.